In the hidden chambers of the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, where silence was currency and discretion was law, there existed a love story that defied every protocol, every tradition, every rule that governed the most powerful throne in Japan. This is not a tale of empresses and state marriages. This is the story of a forbidden affection that shaped an empire from the shadows, a romance preserved in letters so precious they were hidden away for over a century. This is the story of Emperor Meiji and Lady Yanagihara Naruko, and the envelope that contained their truth. To understand this story, you must first understand the cage that was the Chrysanthemum Throne. The Emperor of Japan was not simply a man. He was considered divine, a living god, descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu herself. Every moment of his life was choreographed, every relationship calculated, every emotion carefully contained behind layers of ceremony and tradition. Emperor Meiji ascended to the throne as a teenager, thrust into power during one of the most turbulent periods in Japanese history. The country was being forced open after centuries of isolation. Foreign powers circled like sharks. Ancient samurai clans battled for control. The shogunate that had ruled Japan for hundreds of years was crumbling. And at the center of this maelstrom sat a young emperor, expected to be a symbol, not a man. His marriage was arranged before he even understood what marriage meant. Empress Haruko, later known as Empress Shoken, was chosen for him by the most powerful men in the realm. She was beautiful, refined, educated in all the classical arts. She was perfect in every way that mattered to the court, but she was not chosen by him. And here's where our story truly begins. Because in the rigid hierarchy of the imperial household, there existed a category of women known as consorts. Not wives, not quite mistresses in the Western sense, but sanctioned companions who could bear the emperor children when. A century, telling us something important about love and power, about duty and desire, about the cost of being human in a world that demands you be something more. They say that the Emperor of Japan is divine, descended from heaven, above human concerns. But Emperor Meiji kept that envelope until his death, carried it through wars and crises and the transformation of an empire. Because inside that envelope had been words that mattered more than any imperial decree. Words that reminded him that beneath the crown and the ceremony and the crushing weight of destiny, he was still, somehow, human, and he had been loved. That empty envelope sits in the archives today, a mystery to most who see it. Just an old piece of paper, marked with a forgotten symbol, containing nothing. But to those who know the story, it contains everything. The ghost of a goodbye that never happened. The echo of a love that survived impossible odds. The proof that even in the most controlled, most constrained, most carefully orchestrated life imaginable, something real can exist. Something that history cannot fully document and time cannot fully erase. The envelope of imperial affection remains. Empty, but somehow full. Silent, but somehow speaking. A reminder that the most important stories aren't always the ones that make it into the history books. Sometimes, they're the ones hidden away in locked boxes and classified archives, waiting patiently for the world to be ready to hear them. Emperor Meiji and Lady Yanagihara Naruko, two names that were never supposed to be linked by anything more than duty and bloodline. Two people who found a way to matter to each other in a world that insisted they shouldn't. Their story reminds us that behind every crown, beneath every title, inside every palace and court and ceremony, there are human hearts, beating, hoping, loving against all odds and all expectations. Their world, historians still debate the significance of their relationship. Some see it as a scandal, evidence that even the divine emperor was subject to human weakness. Others see it as a love story, proof that genuine connection can exist even in the most constrained circumstances. Some argue that Naruko wielded considerable political influence through her relationship with Meiji, shaping policy from behind the scenes. Others insist she was simply a woman who loved a man who happened to be an emperor. Perhaps they're all right. Perhaps the truth is more complex than any single interpretation. Perhaps what happened between Emperor Meiji and Lady Yanagihara Naruko was all of these things and none of them. Something that can only be truly understood by reading those letters, by holding that empty envelope, by feeling the weight of a love that carried the burden of an empire. What we know for certain is this. In an age of transformation, when Japan was reinventing itself, two people found something that no amount of modernization could create and no amount of tradition could destroy. They found each other. And for a brief moment in history, an emperor was allowed to be a man and a consort was allowed to be something more. The Meiji era is remembered for railways and constitutions, for wars won and treaties signed, for the transformation of Japan from isolated island nation to world power. The Emperor Meiji is remembered as one of the great rulers in Japanese history, a visionary who guided his country through impossible change. But in those private letters, in that empty envelope, he's remembered as something else, as someone who loved, who struggled, who made choices that history wasn't supposed to record but couldn't completely erase. Lady Yanagihara Naruko is mostly forgotten now, a name in genealogies, a footnote in histories of the imperial court. But her letters remain. Her words persist. And in them, you can hear a voice speaking across more than. Their son became Emperor Taisho, ruling during one of the most chaotic periods in Japanese history. He knew the truth about his parents, about the love that had created him, about the sacrifice his mother had been willing to make. And he ensured that Naruko was cared for, honored, protected for the rest of her life. When she finally passed away, they buried her with full honors. Not as much as an empress would receive, but far more than a consort should expect. And in her personal effects, they found the letters, carefully preserved, waiting to tell their story. For decades, those letters remained classified, imperial household property, too sensitive to release, too intimate to share. The official history of the Meiji era made no mention of a special relationship between the emperor and Lady Yanagihara. She was listed simply as the mother of Emperor Taisho, nothing more. But history has a way of refusing to stay buried. When the letters were finally released, scholars were stunned. Here was the Emperor Meiji they thought they knew, the stern modernizer who had dragged Japan into the modern age, revealed as something else entirely. A man capable of vulnerability, of love, of choosing personal happiness even when it defied every expectation placed upon him. The letters revealed something else too, that Naruko wasn't simply a passive recipient of imperial affection. She was his intellectual equal, his emotional anchor, his connection to a humanity he was supposed to transcend. In a time when women in Japan had few rights and little agency, she had found a way to matter, to influence, to love on her own terms. And that envelope, the empty envelope that had traveled from her hands to his, that had survived wars and revolutions and the collapse of the very system that had tried to keep them apart. It still exists today, preserved in the imperial archives. A physical reminder that once upon a time, an emperor and a lady in waiting defied the rules that governed. Had defied his court for her was dying, inch by inch, crushed beneath the weight of the crown he wore. She wrote him one final letter. This one wasn't about love or loss or longing. It was about gratitude. She thanked him for the moments they'd shared, for the children they'd raised, for proving that even an emperor could choose to be human. She told him that whatever happened, whatever history remembered or forgot, she would carry the truth of their love to her grave. And she asked him to do one thing. Keep the envelope, the original one, the one that had almost contained her goodbye. Keep it safe, so that someday, when the empire and the protocols and the politics were all dust, someone might find it and understand that they had been real. Emperor Meiji passed away after more than 4 decades on the throne. His death was a national event, mourning from one end of Japan to the other. Empress Haruko was at his side in his final moments, as protocol demanded. But among his personal effects, carefully preserved in a locked box, they found letters. Dozens of them, all from Lady Yanagihara Naruko. And one envelope, empty, marked with a symbol that meant it had once contained words for his eyes only. Naruko outlived the emperor by many years. She never remarried, never sought political influence despite being the mother of the crown prince. She lived quietly, raised her children, and wrote poetry that was admired but never published. To the outside world, she was simply a former consort, a footnote in the history of the Meiji era. But she kept copies of the letters, all of them, hidden away where no one would find them during her lifetime. She wanted the truth preserved, even if she wouldn't live to see it revealed. She asked only one thing, that he keep the envelope, not the letter itself, which she asked him to burn, just the envelope, as proof that she had existed, that what they shared had been real, even if history forgot it. The emperor read that letter alone in his chambers, and then he did something unprecedented. He summoned the leaders of his court and made an announcement. Lady Yanagihara Naruko would remain at court. She would be granted additional honors, additional apartments, additional recognition. Their son would be raised with all the ceremony and education befitting an heir, and anyone who had a problem with this arrangement could present their resignation immediately. Silence fell over the court. The emperor had spoken, not as a symbol, not as a living god, but as a man who had made a choice. Naruko stayed. The letters continued, and the envelope, that special envelope that was supposed to contain a goodbye, became instead a symbol of something else, of a love that had survived palace intrigue, political pressure, and the weight of an empire. But their story doesn't have a fairy tale ending. This is history, not legend, and history is rarely kind to love. As Emperor Meiji aged, as the pressures of modernizing Japan took their toll, he grew distant, not from Naruko specifically, but from everyone. The weight of transforming an entire nation from feudal isolation to modern power was crushing. Wars were fought, treaties were signed. Japan became a force on the world stage, but the cost was enormous. Naruko watched the man she loved disappear behind the mask of the emperor. The letters became less frequent, the visits shorter, not because his feelings changed, but because there simply wasn't room in his life anymore for anything but duty. The empire had consumed him completely, leaving nothing for himself. When he was finally able to visit her, in the brief moments stolen from affairs of state, she could see the exhaustion in his eyes. The emperor tutors who would keep him separated from his mother for long periods. Rules about when and where the emperor could visit certain parts of the palace. Meiji resisted, not openly, because an emperor does not openly defy his own court, but quietly, stubbornly. He found ways to see her. The letters continued, and in those letters, you can feel his frustration, his anger at a system that gave him absolute power over the empire, but no power over his own heart. Naruko bore him more children, daughters, who in the cruel mathematics of succession meant less than her son, but whom Meiji loved fiercely nonetheless. Each birth brought them closer together and made the court officials more nervous. This wasn't supposed to be love. This was supposed to be duty, but it had become something else entirely. The turning point came during a period of political crisis. Japan was modernizing rapidly, and not everyone was happy about it. There were assassination attempts, political upheavals, moments when the entire Meiji restoration seemed like it might collapse. During one particularly dangerous period, Naruko sent the emperor a letter. This letter was different from the others. It was sealed in a special envelope, marked with a symbol that meant it was for his eyes only, to be burned after reading. In it, she wrote something that changed everything. She offered to leave. She wrote, that his affection for her had become a political liability. She knew that court officials used their relationship as a weapon against him, as evidence that he was weak, distracted, too human to be divine. She loved him enough, she wrote, to disappear, to take their children and withdraw from court life completely, to let him rule without the complication of a heart. To deliver them would pause to admire the brushwork. She wrote about their son's small victories, his first words, his first steps. She wrote about court gossip, about politics, but always with that edge of wit that made him laugh. She challenged him gently when she thought he was wrong. She comforted him when the burden of empire grew too heavy. They created a secret world in those letters. a place where he wasn't the emperor and she wasn't a consort. They were simply two people who understood each other in a world that understood neither of them. But the palace has eyes, and walls have ears. Empress Haruko knew, of course. It would have been impossible for her not to know. But here is where the story becomes more complex, more human than the simple narrative of jealousy and rivalry. Haruko was not a villain. She was trapped in the same system that trapped them all, married to a man she barely knew, expected to produce heirs her body wouldn't give her, watching another woman provide what she could not. Some accounts suggest she and Naruko reached an understanding, an unspoken agreement. Haruko would remain the empress, first in protocol and ceremony. Naruko would remain in the shadows, the mother of the heir, but never acknowledged publicly as anything more than a consort who had done her duty. It was a fragile peace, maintained through silence and discretion and the Japanese art of saying everything by saying nothing. But there were others in the court who were not so understanding. Conservative officials who believed the emperor's affection for Naruko gave her too much influence. Rival court families who resented the Yanagihara clan's proximity to power. Modernizers who thought the entire consort system was an embarrassment in an era when Japan was trying to present itself as a modern nation to the world. The pressure to end the relationship came from all sides. Subtle at first, a consort reassigned to different quarters, a son who suddenly required. The Empress Haruko could not bear children. This was a crisis that kept the entire court awake at night. An emperor without an heir was a dynasty without a future. So when Naruko became pregnant, there was relief throughout the palace. Finally, an heir. Finally, security for the throne. She gave birth to a son, a healthy, strong boy who would eventually become Emperor Taisho. The court celebrated. Succession was secured. The machinery of empire could continue. But something else happened in that moment. Something the court officials hadn't planned for. The birth of that child bound Meiji and Naruko together in a way no ceremony or protocol could. She wasn't just a consort who had fulfilled her duty. She was the mother of his child, his son, their son, and Meiji, who had been raised to see people as functions and relationships as transactions, discovered what it meant to actually care about someone. The letters began after that. In the Imperial Palace, the emperor's correspondence was monitored, recorded, preserved for history. Every word he wrote was considered sacred, part of the historical record. But Meiji found a way around this. He wrote to Naruko in his own hand, private letters that bypassed the official channels, that were delivered by trusted servants who understood the value of silence. These weren't state documents or formal pronouncements. These were love letters, raw, honest, vulnerable in a way that would have shocked anyone who knew the stern, formal emperor the public saw. He wrote about his fears for their son, about the weight of expectation he hoped the boy would be strong enough to bear. He wrote about the theater performances they had watched together, about poetry that reminded him of her, about the cherry blossoms in the palace gardens that seemed less beautiful when she wasn't there to see them. And Naruko wrote back. Her letters were works of art in themselves. Her calligraphy so exquisite that even the servants who risked everything. The empress could not. It was a practical arrangement in a world obsessed with succession and bloodlines. Lady Yanagihara Naruko entered the Imperial Palace as one of these consorts. She came from a family of court nobles, the Yanagihara clan, who had served the imperial house for generations. She was educated, graceful, versed in poetry and calligraphy. On paper, she was like dozens of other noble daughters who entered palace service. But there was something different about Naruko. Those who knew her described eyes that seemed to hold secrets, a smile that suggested she understood jokes no one else had heard. She moved through the palace corridors with a confidence that bordered on defiance, as if she knew something the rest of them had forgotten. In a world of rigid formality, she possessed something increasingly rare in the imperial court. She was real. Their first meeting was orchestrated, as all things in the palace were. The emperor was expected to spend time with his consorts according to a schedule maintained by court officials. But what happened between Meiji and Naruko in those carefully monitored encounters surprised everyone, most of all themselves. They talked. Not the formal exchanges expected between an emperor and his consort. Real conversation. He told her about the pressures crushing him from all sides, the impossible expectations, the loneliness of being worshipped but never known. She told him about growing up in a family of scholars, about her love of Chinese poetry, about her frustration with the limitations placed on women even in noble families. And somewhere in those conversations, something unexpected bloomed, something dangerous. And sometimes, when we're very lucky, history lets us glimpse that truth. In letters preserved, in envelopes kept, in stories that refuse to stay hidden forever. This was their story, the love that shaped an empire from the shadows, the affection that survived everything the world threw at it, the truth that was too precious to speak aloud, but too important to forget. Remember their names. Remember what they dared to feel in a world that told them feeling was weakness. Remember that love, real love, can exist anywhere, even in the cold corridors of imperial power, even when every rule says it shouldn't. Because in the end, that envelope proved something the court officials and historians and tradition keepers could never quite explain away. It proved that the human heart cannot be legislated or controlled or reduced to protocol. It beats on its own terms. It loves who it chooses. And sometimes, just sometimes, even an emperor must bow to its power.